The wind, a constant companion in the Oklahoma Territory of 1884, whipped Alara's worn skirt around her ankles. It tasted of dust and dry grass, a familiar, harsh flavor that had long replaced the gentler air of her childhood. Her small cabin, barely more than a shack, offered little refuge from the elements or the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Every day was a battle, a quiet war against hunger and loneliness. Since her husband, Thomas, had been taken by the fever 2 years prior, the world had shrunk to the boundaries of her meager plot of land and the relentless demands of survival. Alara's hands, though calloused from endless chores, still held a memory of softness. She often found herself tracing the faint lines on her palm, remembering Thomas's touch, his laughter. Those memories, though sweet, were also a heavy weight, a constant reminder of what she had lost. She missed his strong arms, his steady presence, and the way he could always make her smile, even when times were hard. Now, there was only silence, broken by the creak of the floorboards or the distant howl of a coyote. She had tried everything to make ends meet. She mended clothes for the few scattered neighbors, traded what little produce her small garden yielded, and even tried her hand at trapping, though her heart wasn't truly in it. Each sunrise brought with it the same question. How would she get through another day? The answer was rarely clear, often a desperate scramble. Today, however, felt different. A sense of foreboding hung in the air, thicker than the dust. She'd spent the morning patching the leaky roof, her mind wandering back to Thomas, to their shared dreams that now lay buried with him. The world felt vast and unforgiving, and she, a tiny, solitary figure, felt as though she were slowly fading into its harsh landscape. The past, with its grief and unfulfilled hopes, was a shadow she could never quite outrun. The foreboding feeling that had settled over Alara that morning intensified when she heard the distinct clip-clop of a horse approaching her cabin. Few people ventured this far out, and fewer still had reason to call on her. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart giving a little jump of surprise as Sheriff Brody dismounted his horse. He was a stern man, his face weathered by sun and worry, and he rarely visited unless there was trouble. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice gravelly but kind enough. He removed his hat, revealing a bald spot that gleamed in the harsh sunlight. "I wouldn't bother you if it wasn't important." Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on his serious expression. "What is it, Sheriff?" "We found a drifter dead on the old Wagon trail, just past the creek bed," he explained, gesturing vaguely towards the west. "Looks like he just stopped. No family, no identification, just a wagon and a few belongings." He paused, shifting his weight. "Nobody else around here has the stomach for it, or the proper tools. And I know you buried Thomas with your own hands. You're a strong woman, Alara." Alara's breath caught in her throat. Burying Thomas had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, a task born of necessity and deep love. To bury a stranger, someone with no name or story, felt different, almost cold. Yet, the sheriff's words, "Nobody else around here has the stomach for it," echoed in her mind. She was strong, and, more importantly, the sheriff was offering payment. A few dollars, perhaps enough to buy flour and sugar, maybe even a new pair of boots. She looked at the ground, then back at the sheriff. "How much?" she asked, her voice a little rough. Sheriff Brody named a sum that made her eyes widen slightly. It was more than she'd seen in weeks. "I'll help you get the wagon back to your place, if you'll seat him proper," he added. The thought of digging another grave, of facing death again, sent a shiver down her spine. But the thought of an empty stomach, of another day without hope, was a far colder prospect. "All right, Sheriff," Alara said, taking a deep breath. "I'll do it." With a heavy heart and a shovel clutched in her hand, Alara followed Sheriff Brody back to the drifter's wagon. The man lay still on the hard ground, covered by a thin, dusty blanket. The sheriff helped her hitch the drifter's old, tired horse to the wagon, then left her to her grim task, promising to return later with the promised payment. Alara sighed, looking at the crude wooden wagon. It was small, with peeling paint and wheels that looked like they might give out at any moment. She began to dig a shallow grave nearby, the earth dry and stubborn beneath her shovel. The sun beat down, making her brow slick with sweat, but she pushed through, her mind focused on the flour and sugar the payment would buy. Once the grave was ready, she approached the wagon, intending to gather any personal items that might be used to identify the man, or at least a place in his grave. She carefully pulled back the canvas tarp that covered the back of the wagon, expecting to find only worn blankets or perhaps a few cooking pots. Instead, a soft, whimpering sound, barely audible above the wind, reached her ears. Alara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She pulled the canvas back further, her eyes widening in disbelief. Tucked into a makeshift bed of old quilts, no bigger than a loaf of bread, was a baby. A tiny, perfect human, no older than a few months, with a shock of dark hair and eyes closed in uneasy sleep. A wave of pure, fierce protectiveness washed over Alara. This wasn't just a dead drifter anymore. This was a father, and this was his child, left alone in the vast, unforgiving territory. The baby stirred, letting out a small, hungry cry. Alara's instincts, long dormant since Thomas's death, surged to life. She reached in, her hands trembling as she gently scooped the infant into her arms. The baby felt warm and surprisingly heavy, a tiny bundle of life against her chest. The world, which had felt so empty moments before, suddenly filled with an urgent, overwhelming purpose. This child, nameless and alone, was now hers to protect. Clutching the baby to her chest, Alara quickly finished the drifter's burial. The task, once a grim chore, now felt secondary, almost an afterthought. She hitched the drifter's horse and wagon to her own, a strange procession heading back towards her cabin. The baby, a girl, had stopped crying and was now simply looking up at Alara with wide, curious eyes. Her little hand, no bigger than Alara's thumb, gripped tightly on her finger, a tiny anchor in a world that had just been turned upside down. Back at her cabin, the reality of her discovery began to sink in. She had a baby, a helpless, hungry baby, and not a single item in her sparse home was meant for an infant. No kradli, no softes vadlin kloches, no milky. Panic flickered, cold and sharp, but it was quickly pushed aside by the fierce warmth of her new purpose. This child needed her. You need a name, little one, Alara whispered, gently rocking the baby. The infant cooed, a soft, sweet sound that filled the quiet cabin. You're like a tiny flower found in the wilderness. A lily. Yes, that's it. Lily. She laid Lily down on her own bed, carefully wrapping her in her softest shawl. Then, Alara began to search the drifter's wagon. Among the few worn items, she found a small, dented tin with a few coins, barely enough for a single meal, and a faded, worn blanket that smelled faintly of rosewater. No baby clothes, no bottles, nothing. The drifter had clearly been trying to hide the baby, or perhaps had been too poor to afford proper supplies. The challenge ahead was immense. Alara had barely enough food for herself, let alone a growing infant. How would she feed Lily? How would she keep her warm through the cold prairie nights? Her mind raced, trying to find solutions where there seemed to be none. But as Lily stirred, her tiny hand reaching out, Alara knew one thing for sure. She would find a way. She had to. This little Lily was now her responsibility, her heart's new, fragile hope. Days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and desperate attempts to care for Lily. Alara managed to trade some of the drifter's few possessions for a small amount of goat's milk and a worn baby blanket from a kind, if curious, neighbor. Every penny she had, and every bit of energy, was now devoted to the tiny life she held. The sheriff had paid her for the burial, but the money quickly dwindled, eaten up by Lily's needs. Meanwhile, a dust-covered horseman rode into the small, dusty town that served as the nearest hub of civilization. His name was Silas, and he had the same dark, intense eyes as the drifter Alara had buried. He dismounted in front of the general store, his gaze sweeping over the unfamiliar faces. He was looking for someone, his brother Jacob. Silas had traveled for weeks, following a vague trail of rumors and half-truths. Jacob, always restless, had sent a letter months ago, hinting at a new venture out west, but then the letters had stopped. A bad feeling had settled in Silas's gut, a cold knot of worry that only grew with each passing day. He asked around, describing his brother, showing a faded drawing of a man with a crooked smile. Jacob Hayes, he'd say, his voice firm but laced with an underlying concern. Has anyone seen him? He'd be traveling in an old wagon, maybe with a bay horse. Most folks shook their heads or offered vague, unhelpful answers. But then, the store owner, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, scratched his chin. Hayes, you say? Well, Sheriff Brody handled a burial just a few days back. A drifter. No name, mind you, but he had a wagon, much like you described. Silas's heart sank. Where's he buried? Who buried him? He asked, his voice tight with a sudden, terrible dread. He had no idea that his brother's wagon, or the life it carried, was now at Alara's humble cabin, a few miles outside of town. He also had no idea that his world was about to change forever. Armed with the grim news from the store owner, Silas rode hard towards Alara's cabin, his heart heavy with grief and a growing sense of urgency. The small dwelling came into view, and his eyes immediately landed on the familiar old wagon parked beside it. There was no mistaking it. The peeling paint and worn wheels were Jacob's. His brother was indeed gone. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and approached the cabin door. Before he could knock, it opened, and Alara stood there, her expression wary. She had Lily cradled in her arms, wrapped in the faded rosewater blanket he recognized from his brother's wagon. Silas's eyes flickered to the baby, a brief moment of confusion before his grief reasserted itself. He hadn't expected to see a child. Mrs. Hayes? Silas asked, his voice rough with emotion. I'm Silas. Silas Hayes. I understand you buried a drifter recently. My brother, Jacob. Alara's face, already pale from worry and lack of sleep, seemed to drain of all color. She clutched Lily tighter, the baby stirring slightly. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I did. And the wagon, Silas continued, gesturing towards it. It's his. What was he doing out here? And why was he alone? Where are his things? His gaze swept around, landing on Lily again. And who is this? He asked, not unkindly, but with a note of bewildered curiosity. He was too caught up in his brother's death to truly focus on the baby, assuming she was perhaps a neighbor's child Alara was watching. Alara's mind raced. How much should she tell him? Could she protect Lily if she revealed the truth? The fierce instinct to guard the child warred with the knowledge that this man was her uncle. He was alone, Mr. Hayes, she said, choosing her words carefully. He just stopped on the trail. And his things, I have them inside. The sheriff told me to keep them safe. She avoided his question about Lily, hoping to buy herself more time to figure out what to do. The baby cooed softly, a tiny, innocent sound that only deepened Alara's resolve. Alara felt Silas's eyes on Lily, a casual glance that held no suspicion, only a passing curiosity. She knew she couldn't keep the truth hidden forever, but a desperate, animal-like instinct screamed at her to protect the baby. What if Silas, once he knew, decided Lily was his responsibility? What if he took her away, back to wherever he came from, a place Alara knew nothing about? The thought twisted her stomach. Lily was hers now, her reason for living, the fragile hope that had blossomed in her desolate life. His things are in the wagon, Alara repeated, trying to sound calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs. You can look through them, Mr. Hayes. I haven't touched anything beyond what the sheriff asked. She gestured vaguely towards the back of the cabin where the wagon was hitched. Silas nodded, his brow furrowed with grief. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I appreciate your honesty. He didn't press about the baby, his mind clearly preoccupied with his brother. He turned and walked towards the wagon, his shoulders slumped. Alara watched him go, relief and guilt warring within her. Relief that she had bought herself more time, guilt for holding back the truth. She squeezed Lily gently, the baby gurgling contentedly, completely unaware of the tense drama unfolding around her. "It's all right, my little Lily," Alara whispered, pressing a kiss to the baby's soft head. "I won't let anyone take you." She knew her decision to keep Lily's parentage a secret was a dangerous one, a lie that would surely unravel. But in that moment, with the warmth of the baby in her arms, it felt like the only choice she could make. She imagined Silas, a lone man, try to raise an infant on the road, or worse, leaving her in an orphanage. No, she couldn't allow it. Lily deserved a home, a mother, and Alara, despite her poverty, felt she was the only one who could provide it. She would fight for this child, no matter the cost. Silas spent the next few days sifting through Jacob's meager belongings in the wagon, a somber task that only deepened his grief. He found old letters, a worn Bible, and a few faded photographs, but nothing to explain why his brother had been traveling alone or why he had hidden a baby. He watched Alara from a distance, seeing her tireless efforts to care for the infant. Lily's cries, at first startling, slowly became a part of the cabin's rhythm, a tiny, insistent beat of life. He felt a strange pull towards a small family. His duty was to understand Jacob's last days, to settle his affairs, and then to move on. Yet, the sight of Alara, a lone woman struggling in this harsh land with a baby to care for, stirred something within him beyond simple pity. He noticed the leaky roof, the broken fence posts, the way Alara had to carry water from the distant well, all while holding or tending to Lily. One afternoon, as Alara struggled to chop firewood with a dull axe, Silas approached her. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Let me help you with that. It's too much for one person." Alara hesitated, surprised by his offer. "You don't have to, Mr. Hayes." "Silas," he corrected, taking the axe from her. "And yes, I do. My brother. He was a good man, though he often made bad choices. You did right by him, giving him a proper burial. Let me do right by you, at least for a while." And so, Silas began to help. He fixed the roof, mended the fence, chopped wood, and even helped tend to Alara's small, struggling garden. He was quiet, efficient, and surprisingly gentle. He still hadn't asked about Lily again, but Alara noticed his eyes lingering on the baby, a softening in his gaze whenever she gurgled or reached out a tiny hand. He was a man torn, she realized, between the ghost of his brother and the living, breathing needs of the woman and child before him. A silent understanding began to grow between them, built on shared sorrow and unspoken needs. The days Silas spent at Alara's homestead stretched into weeks. The work was hard, but shared burdens felt lighter. They spoke little at first, their conversations mostly about chores or the weather, but a deeper connection began to form in the quiet moments. They would sit on the small porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the prairie horizon, the silence between them no longer awkward, but comforting. Lily, nestled in Alara's arms or asleep in a makeshift cradle Silas had fashioned from a sturdy crate, was a constant, gentle presence. Alara found herself looking forward to Silas's quiet strength, his steady hands, and the way he would sometimes catch her eye and offer a small, reassuring smile. He listened when she spoke of Thomas, not with pity, but with a shared understanding of loss. And she, in turn, listened as he spoke of Jacob, of his brother's wild spirit and the worries he'd always caused. They both carried grief, a heavy cloak that bound them together in a way neither had expected. One evening, as Lily slept soundly, Silas found Alara struggling to mend a torn shirt by the dim lamplight. "You work too hard, Alara," he said softly, sitting on the stool opposite her. She looked up, a tired smile gracing her lips. "There's always work on a homestead, Silas, especially with a little one." He nodded, his gaze falling to Lily's cradle. "She's a good baby. You're a good mother to her." His words were simple, but they warmed Alara's heart. He saw her, not just as a widow, but as a mother capable and loving. In the shared rhythm of daily tasks, the challenges of frontier life, and the quiet comfort of each other's presence, something new began to grow. It wasn't loud or sudden, but a gentle unfolding, like the first shoots of spring after a long, hard winter. A connection forged in sorrow, but budding with the promise of something more. The unspoken truth about Lily still hung between them, a fragile thread, but for now, the shared humanity was enough. The unspoken truth about Lily weighed heavily on Alara, a secret that felt increasingly wrong as her bond with Silas deepened. He had become a constant, a steady hand, and a kind presence in her lonely world. The guilt pricked at her, knowing she was withholding such a significant part of his brother's story and Lily's. She knew the time had come. One blustery afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in, forcing them inside. Lily was asleep in her cradle, the rhythmic patter of rain against the roof filling the silence. Silas sat by the small fire, mending a bridle. Alara took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Silas," she began, her voice a little shaky. He looked up, his dark eyes questioning. "There's something I need to tell you. Something important about Jacob." Silas put down the bridle, his expression serious. "What is it, Alara?" She took another breath, forcing the words out. "Lily, she's not just a baby I found. She's your brother's child, Jacob's daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Silas's eyes widened, his face paling. He stared at her, then at the sleeping baby, a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion warring in his gaze. "Jacob's? My brother had a child, but he never spoke of a wife, a family." Alara explained everything. Finding Lily hidden in the wagon, the desperate need to protect her, her fear that Silas would take the baby away. She spoke of Jacob's meager belongings, the worn blanket, the lack of anything to suggest he was prepared for an infant. As she spoke, tears welled in her eyes, a mix of relief at finally telling the truth and fear of his reaction. Silas listened, his expression a mix of shock, sorrow, and a dawning understanding. He looked at Lily, really looked at her, and in her tiny features he suddenly saw a hint of Jacob. The world had shifted on its axis, and his quiet grief for a lost brother now held a whole new, living dimension. Silas spent the rest of that stormy afternoon in a daze, the revelation about Lily swirling in his mind. Jacob, his wayward brother, a father? It was almost unbelievable. He paced the small cabin, running his hand through his hair, trying to make sense of a life his brother had kept entirely secret. The grief for Jacob, already a dull ache, now twisted with confusion and a touch of anger. Why had Jacob never said anything? Who was Lily's mother? So many unanswered questions. Alara watched him, her heart heavy, waiting for his anger, for his decision to take Lily. But Silas didn't lash out. He simply grappled with the news, his face a roadmap of conflicting emotions. When Lily woke with a soft cry, a familiar instinct took over. Silas, without thinking, walked to the cradle and gently picked her up. As he held her, the tiny bundle of life nestled against his chest. Something shifted within him. He looked at her, really looked, and in the curve of her small nose, the shape of her mouth, he saw Jacob. A softer version, perhaps, but undeniably his brother. A wave of tenderness, profound and unexpected, washed over him. This wasn't just a baby anymore. This was family. His niece. His anger at Jacob began to soften, replaced by a deep sorrow for his brother's lonely end and the secret burden he must have carried. Lily gurgled, her small hand reaching up to grasp his finger, and Silas felt a connection that went beyond blood. He had already grown fond of this child, had already felt a pull to protect her. Now, that feeling deepened, solidified into a fierce, unwavering commitment. He looked at Alara, a new understanding shining in his eyes. "You protected her," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Alara. Thank you for not letting her be alone." He knew then that he couldn't leave them. He couldn't leave Lily, and he couldn't leave the woman who had already become a quiet anchor in his life. After Silas's heartfelt words, a profound sense of peace settled over Alara. The fear that had gripped her since finding Lily finally loosened its hold. She saw the truth in his eyes. He wouldn't take Lily away. Instead, he offered something far more precious. "What will we do, Silas?" Alara asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper, as she looked from him to the sleeping baby. The question hung in the air, weighted with uncertainty and a fragile hope. Silas gently placed Lily back in her cradle. He turned to Alara, his gaze steady and filled with a quiet resolve. "We raise her," he said simply. "Together. She's family, Alara. My brother's blood, and you've already proven yourself her mother." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and firm, a silent promise. "This land is harsh, and life is hard, but we can face it, together." Alara's heart swelled. She looked at their joined hands, then at Lily, then back at Silas. In his eyes, she saw not just compassion, but a glimmer of something deeper, something that mirrored the feelings stirring within her own heart. The shared grief for Thomas and Jacob, the daily struggles they had faced side by side, and now, this tiny, innocent life had woven them together in an unexpected, beautiful way. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "Together." In that moment, a decision was made, not just to care for Lily, but to build a life. The sorrow of their past would always be a part of them, but it no longer overshadowed everything. Instead, it had cleared a path for a new beginning, a fragile seed of love blooming in the barren landscape of their grief. They would be a family, bound not just by circumstance, but by choice, by hope, and by the tiny, precious life of Lily. With their decision made, a new purpose settled over Alara and Silas. The cabin, once a symbol of Alara's solitary struggle, now hummed with a different energy. Silas, with his strong back and practical skills, transformed the homestead. The leaky roof was properly mended, the fence post stood straight and tall, and a small, sturdy addition was built onto the cabin to serve as a proper nursery for Lily. He brought new tools, seeds for a larger garden, and even managed to trade for a milk cow, ensuring Lily would have plenty to drink. Alara, no longer burdened by the full weight of survival alone, found her spirit lifting. She cooked hearty meals, mended clothes, and nurtured Lily with a boundless love that now felt complete. She watched Silas with a warmth that grew daily, admiring his quiet strength and his tender way with the baby. He would often hold Lily, singing old, off-key lullabies that made Alara smile. The once stern man was now a gentle, devoted uncle, and in all but name, a father. They spoke more openly now, sharing their dreams for Lily, for the land, for their future. The ghosts of Thomas and Jacob still lingered, but they were no longer shadows of sorrow. They were part of the story that had brought Alara and Silas together. Love, a gentle and resilient thing, had begun to bloom in the dusty soil of their shared grief. It wasn't the passionate, whirlwind romance of storybooks, but a steady, deep affection built on respect, shared purpose, and a mutual devotion to the little girl who had unexpectedly tied their lives together. The challenges of the Oklahoma Territory were still immense, but facing them together felt less daunting. They were a family, not by traditional means, but by a powerful act of will and an open heart. Each sunrise was no longer a question of mere survival, but an opportunity to build something lasting, something beautiful from the wreckage of their individual pasts. The sun dipped low, painting the vast Oklahoma sky in hues of orange and purple. On the small porch of their now sturdier cabin, Alara sat, Lily nestled against her chest, fast asleep. Silas sat beside her, his arm casually draped around her shoulders, a gesture that had become as natural as the sunrise. The scent of cooking stew drifted from inside, a warm, comforting smell that spoke of home. Life in the territory was still a daily test, but the biting edge of loneliness had dulled, replaced by the quiet strength of their shared purpose. The cabin stood as a beacon of their resilience, a testament to what love and dedication could build from dust and sorrow. Lily, now nearly a year old, was a bright spark, her giggles a melody that chased away the lingering echoes of grief. She would soon be walking, chasing butterflies in the tall prairie grass, her future stretching out bright and full of promise. Alara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer defined them. Thomas and Jacob were remembered, not with bitterness, but as part of the intricate tapestry of their lives, the threads that had, in a strange twist of fate, brought them together. Silas squeezed her shoulder gently. "A good day, Alara," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over their small patch of land, the sturdy garden, the healthy cow in the small pen. "A very good day, Silas," she agreed, her voice soft with contentment. She looked out at the endless horizon, the wide, wild beauty of the Oklahoma Territory. It was a land of challenges, yes, but also a land of endless possibility. With Silas by her side and Lily safe in her arms, Alara knew they could face anything. Their family, born from sorrow and sustained by love, was a testament to enduring hope, shining bright under the vast, open sky. They were home, truly home, at last.